Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm John Iwata here at the Yale School of Management in New Haven, Connecticut. I co-lead the Yale program on stakeholder innovation and management here at Yale, which studies how leaders create long-term value by building mutually beneficial relationships with customers, employees, communities, investors, and other stakeholders. Since 2019, our program has conducted some 200 interviews with chief executive officers, including with our guest today, Jakob Stausholm, as part of research that has informed the development of many Yale case studies, including one on Rio Tinto, which Jakob led as CEO. We're joined this morning by students and faculty here at Yale in this classroom, as well as students connected with the more than 30 business schools that are part of the Global Network for Advanced Management. Many more will view this recording later, so to all of you, welcome. We look forward to your questions and observations for Jakob, and if you're here in the classroom, please use the QR code that you received when you entered to submit your questions. And if you're joining us online, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. I'll select questions from both groups, and I'll give priority to those who include your name and school. It's my pleasure to introduce Jakob to our session today. He served as Chief Executive Officer of Rio Tinto for more than 4 years, from January 2021 until just a few months ago. Before becoming CEO, he was the Chief Financial Officer of Rio Tinto and also held many senior roles in finance strategy and transformation at companies including AP Moller-Maersk and Shell. Today, Jakob is a fellow at Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government. Rio Tinto, if you're not familiar with Rio Tinto, it is one of the world's largest mining and metals companies operating in more than 30 countries, producing iron ore, copper, aluminum, and other critical minerals. Jakob was appointed CEO under very unusual and dramatic circumstances. In 2020, Rio Tinto blasted 46,000-year-old Aboriginal rock shelters at Juukan Gorge in Western Australia. The sites were among the most significant archaeological and cultural heritage locations in the country. Rio Tinto had a legal right to destroy these caves, but the act triggered global outrage. Traditional owners of the land expressed deep grief, as you would expect. Institutional investors publicly condemned the company, which you may not expect. The media coverage was scathing, and a parliamentary inquiry by the Australian government called the destruction, quote, inexcusable and avoidable. Rio CEO at the time, 2 other senior executives, and the board chair resigned. And Jakob was shortly appointed CEO under those circumstances. And it was a few months after he became CEO that he kindly agreed to speak to us for our CEO research. And I have to say, it was a very sobering conversation. And as he had just begun being CEO, we asked whether we could check back with him in about a year. And he generously said, yes, if I'm still in the job. He certainly was. Today, we're going to talk with Jakob about how he approached this challenge, what resulted, and what he learned from that he can share with all of us. Please join me in welcoming Jakob Stausholm. Thank you. Now, I know most of you in today's session have not gone through the Rio Tinto case study. And I don't want to use our time forcing Jakob to retell a very complex story. However, to appreciate what Jakob led, he and his team led, what resulted, I'm going to invite him to share a few things, and then we really want to get to your questions as soon as possible. But let me start by asking you, Jakob, for the students and faculty in today's session who may not be familiar with the environment, the situation that you inherited as CEO, maybe you want to describe a little bit more about that, particularly from the multi-stakeholder view. And then most importantly, we're all imagining ourselves being in your situation. How did you approach this problem? How did you frame it in your mind?
Yeah, thank you, John, and thanks for the invitation. First of all, John very skillfully said, now you have avoided to go to Yale because you're always too busy, and I see you are stepping down as CEO, so I suppose you don't have an excuse for going. So here am I, and I'm really happy to be here today. Now, it was a very special time in 2020. We had COVID, we were all under lockdown, so just the ability to lead was kind of different. I have worked in 6 international companies, so I've seen a little bit different things, different corporate cultures. I joined as CFO. It was a year and a half before the explosion of the rock shelters. And I had managed to get around and travel around and saw what an impact Rio Tinto was doing in local communities all around the world, but also the role we play on the international scene. I mean, you couldn't build nations the way you're building nations without what we are producing, and we tend to forget that. So I could see an important purpose in what we were doing as a company, but I could also see that we were suffering in our culture from some events that actually lay down 10, 15 years back. And therefore, I very much believe that we had to work on the culture and get the good self-confidence back in Rio Tinto. So that was kind of how we went into the COVID lockdown, and in a way it was horrible what happened with Juukan Gorge, but it was a bit what you call the straw that broke the camel's back, and it enabled us to go on a significant change journey. In fact, it's pretty amazing when you're down on your knees that it forces you to become a little bit humble and actually really listen to what others are saying rather than just standing up and I'm listening to you, but yes, but I'm not going to change my mind. That doesn't work. And now you might not know Rio Tinto. We're reasonable big in the US, but in some countries, and I understand there are people listening in from Australia, Rio Tinto is, if not the biggest, then the second biggest taxpayer in Australia, and is massive in Australia, is massive in Canada. And in some development nations, if you take a country like Mongolia, we're 1/3 of the GDP. So everybody is watching this company. How is this company doing? Is it doing the right things for the society, etc.? And yes, of course, as CEO, you're responsible for making sure that the investors who have invested their money are getting a return. But ultimately, you can only achieve that by creating value for society at large. And if you do that well, you actually can create a great return for your shareholders. I firmly believe in that.
Jakob, the questions are beginning to come in. I do want to pursue a little bit more of the framing for the participants in our session today. So we are familiar, unfortunately, we're familiar with companies getting themselves into a crisis situation. But what you did, you started with things like revisiting the purpose, literally the purpose statement of the company. You started to think about the values that underpin the culture of the company. It is not obvious to some that that's where you would start, given the crisis that you inherited.
And I decided to look at the roots of the company. The company is 153 years old, and there were moments where Rio Tinto was the undisputed leader of mining in the world. So I thought there are some uniqueness in this culture and this history. I spoke to some of the former CEOs. So I spoke to, today, John Ralph is 93 years old. He worked 46 years for the company. His father worked for the company. His grandfather worked for the company. And his grandfather actually died in a mining accident 100 years ago. So I became quite humble about that because I worked in many different industries and I was new to mining. And the kind of commitment, his successor worked 50 years for the company as well. So I needed to find out certain things were still relevant and certain things have changed because the world is changing. But to believe that everything has changed is just not true. And it's really about tapping into that because many people had worked 25, 30 years in the company, and they remember the strengths that we had there. And to refine that strength was really important for me, because I wanted to make significant change in a company, and you are not making significant change by just standing up and rallying some kind of wild vision. You actually really need to gain that deep commitment in people, because they're the ones who has to do. I mean, you can only create the conditions. It's your people, your leaders, who has to actually make the change happening.
Why don't more CEOs, especially in a moment when they're trying to change the company in some way, transform it, turn it around, why don't you think CEOs look into history, talk to their predecessors? It's not common.
The time pressure is relentless, and you have to be very deliberate on how you spend your time. Think about the following. When you're a CEO, you could spend the whole day on your inbox, on your email. But try to think, what does it mean to deal with an inbox? It basically means that you are reactive, because you respond to something, i.e. you're not setting agenda when you respond to it. That doesn't mean that you don't need to respond to things. Of course you have to. But the risk is that the reactive part of your work takes over. There's always somebody who wants, what should I do with this? What should I do with that? In fact, what you need to do is to find that balance between proactivity, thinking about where you're going to take the company, and then, of course, help your organization. But in my case, and I feel quite comfortable about that, you do need to work a lot on the proactive case, be clear about where you want to take it, and then dare to delegate. Dare to empower your people, because if you don't delegate, you're going to kill yourself, and you will be overworked, and you will not be the best yourself.
I have a question here from, you'd mentioned before the importance of the leadership team. I mean, in our interviews, you were hesitant to talk about yourself very much. So let's consider this question. It comes from Leah Kowero from the Strathmore Business School in Kenya. In your experience, how do organizational culture and leadership structure shape the success of strategy execution?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question, and I always, one of the quotes I use most is from Peter Drucker, who has this quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it really does, because of course you don't want a strategy where you go in the wrong direction, but ultimately it is about the ability to execute the strategy, and you need to bring the people behind it, and the culture has to work with you. If not, you kind of have the wind against you all the time. I'm not a great believer in too many organizational setup and organizational changes, because there is no perfect organization. All organizations are designed to achieve certain things and will have some unintended consequences. That was also why I decided not to change culture when I change organization, but rather work on the culture and work on the leadership development. When I was appointed in December 2020, I decided to just spend my whole Christmas, we were all in lockdown mode in any case, hiring 3 global search firms and setting up interviews with top 30 people that I had identified in the company, looked at external people. And it took me like 3 or 4 weeks to set up my 11-person executive team, and basically everyone except 1 or 2 got into new roles. So it was a whole new leadership team I appointed. I very much believe in collective decision making. That doesn't mean that it's a voting and it's democracy. For example, when I said in 2 years' time, we are going to turn 150, so I suggest we write a history book. Everybody thought it was the dumbest idea on the planet. And I think it was like 10-1 against, and I was the only one voting for it. But in the end of the day, I decided we're going to do this. But it's about drawing upon amazing people with amazing experiences, and then you have to follow your instinct and lead from the front. It's quite uncomfortable in the beginning, because the first few months where you're appointed, everybody looks towards you, and you still haven't really got your team up and running. So I was trying to early, communicate little. I talked about 4 priorities for the company. We must be the best operator. We must have impeccable ESG performance. We must think long term. I call it excellent development. And we must have a strong social license. The reason why I went out with that early without really being able to consult the team, because I didn't have a team at the time, was to say, if I can feed the media with this, they have an idea of where I'm heading. And then I have time to work with the leadership team, and together we can develop a comprehensive strategy.
Again, we document in the case study this, it's kind of hard to put it, this holistic operating plan, or almost an architecture of a new purpose, of a cultural change underpinned by 3 new values, and then these 4 objectives put together into a plan with accountability and targets. And this was the first time you were CEO, yes?
Absolutely.
Where did you come up with the idea that you needed to have this holistic operating plan or strategy? Where did that come from?
Well, I had 10 interviews with the board to become CEO. And at the time where we had terrible press, you could read in the newspapers, we need an external CEO who can come in and change all the management team and get some decent people in. And I worked from a completely different assumption. I told them, we got amazing people inside this company, but we need to fix the culture. And it's my role setting the boundary conditions and making conditions so that people can unfold themselves at their potential. And that's where you need to start from some perhaps a little bit abstract things like purpose and 4 objectives and values, and then really nail it in. What does that mean? And I've now spoken about the 4 objectives, but let's take the 2 others. Values came very quickly, and it was not my idea, the exact values, but it was like, it just happened in an hour in the management team. Care, courage, and curiosity. We realized, and I must say, now we're sitting here at Yale, Professor Amy Edmondson from Harvard, I find her absolutely outstanding, and I've used her as well for our leadership meetings. Her theory about psychological safety is absolutely fundamental. If anybody believes that you can create a performance organization by just trying to hammer people hard and drive things from the top down extremely hard, they completely miss the point. What you want, I'm very ambitious. I want to set extremely high standards for my company, but you can only get that to work if you can create an environment of psychological safety that people feel comfortable to speak up, to challenge, and not docking things. The biggest risk for a CEO is when a CEO doesn't start hearing what he needs to hear or she needs to hear. So care is the starting point. Next one is courage. Courage to be a bit vulnerable, to dare to talk about the things that is not comfortable, but that people needs to talk about, but needs to come on the table. It's not about nice. Nice is a terrible word. I find niceness as being false. Niceness is that we try to have a good atmosphere here, because the thing that we really need to talk about might actually destroy the good atmosphere. We have to have that courage, and it starts with ourselves. I think Brené Brown, she always talks about, there is no courage where there's no vulnerability. Bring yourself in. And the third thing is, and this should be so relevant for all of you here at Yale and any university, curiosity. The day we lose our curiosity, we should retire. I mean, you have to keep on challenging the assumptions, etc. So those became the values, and I immediately initiated a very deep leadership development, first for the top 100, but later on for top 500, really focusing on a mantra that I believe in, that how can you lead others if you can't lead yourself? How can you lead yourself if you don't know yourself? A lot, I would say, should you ask me a question for any advice, I would say, make sure that you get to know yourself. And for me, I'm not born as a leader, that's for sure, but I worked pretty damn hard on it throughout my career. And it's still imperfect because leadership is imperfect and you keep on making mistakes. So the question is, do I learn from that and am I excelling? Absolutely critical. So that's the value part and the leadership part. Then the last thing I haven't spoken about is the purpose, because I very early identified that we needed a new purpose, and you think that cannot be that difficult. Nonetheless, it took me 2 years to get to it, and I had all sorts of people advising. And I think in the end, I wrote the 10 words myself, and it's so simple, but let me try to explain why this balance can be quite difficult. Finding better ways to provide the materials the world needs. So sometimes there can be a bit of a guilt working for a mining company, working in a mine, because think about it, you kind of dig in the earth. Does it have an impact? Of course it does have an impact. But what I always say to my people in the mine is saying, you're not responsible for that we are digging, say, copper out of the ground here. That's all of us. Us, the consumer. We decide that we want to live in an industrial society that requires these materials. Now, where's the responsibility for us? It's in the first part of the sentence, finding better ways. We are really responsible for that things are done to the highest standards with least impact. Finding better ways means being as efficient as possible, using the best possible technology, having as little CO2 emission as possible, having as little impact on biodiversity and nature, having a positive impact to the local society, having a positive impact to the country you're in, etc. That's where we need, but don't feel guilty about extracting. Ultimately, if you have a mine, it's a societal choice. It's a societal choice. And you need to go through an application and get permission to do this mining. The country decides upon that. So it took a long time, but I do think that that purpose statement is actually quite powerful for us.
The questions are flying in here. So let's take one from Richard here in the classroom at Yale. Richard, you had a question about the balance between shareholders and stakeholders. Do we have a microphone? Yes, and please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Richard Sechiyama from the MAM class, Rio School of Management. So my question is in relation to stakeholder management as against the shareholder. How have you balanced this conflict between them? I know it's one of the challenges that leaders go through, managing stakeholders as against shareholders' interest. So how have you managed that in your career? And what advice would you give to upcoming leaders?
So, wow. I thought I had an answer until the last few words you said in my career, because I have mainly been a CFO and I have been thinking a lot shareholder value, and I'm really good at the spreadsheets and the NPV calculations. And I actually realized that I had to de-learn a lot of what I had learned when I became CEO for Rio Tinto. And I don't think that there is a conflict, because the key word is, as a CEO, you have a fiduciary responsibility to take the best interest for your company and your shareholders. But the key word is long-term. It's a very long-term company. And I don't see any way where you can create long-term value for a company like Rio Tinto unless you serve well your stakeholders. You have to find a way where it works for the country you're in, where it works for the local communities, where you are seen as, okay, you might have an impact, but you're trying to reduce your impact to the absolutely minimum possible, being CO2, being nature, being biodiversity. So I have actually felt in this job that has not been a conflict. Where is conflict sometimes coming is that companies goes out and make very broad statements about, the world should really reduce, for example, CO2 emissions, etc. But that's not our job. Our job is, I come back a little bit to the Milton Friedman about the business of business is business. I'm not preaching outside the company, I'm preaching within the company. Within this company, we got to set high standards. We have a clear plan and we will achieve minus 50% CO2 emissions by 2030. But actually, it's quite profitable because suddenly we are changing in, for example, Australia, from coal-fired power to renewable power, and it makes economic sense. So nobody can have any views against that, I would argue. And I think we are, by doing so, future-proofing our business.
Is a related question here from Junzei Fu from the University of British Columbia Sauder School of Business. Was it the crisis that reshaped Rio Tinto's purpose, culture, and strategy? Or did Rio Tinto's purpose, culture, and strategy and values serve as the core strengths to deal with the crisis?
That's a very thoughtful question. I mean, the answer is yes on the first. But I think you should think about culture like an ocean. An ocean has got streams. Sometimes you have got some deeper streams and you got some different streams higher up. And we had kind of lost it a little bit with the, say, surface streams, but we still had a deeper stream from the past that was a strength. So the crisis forced us to be humble, forced ourselves to be self-critical, and forced us to change. But we were helped by our history, that we didn't have to invent things, we just had to refound certain things.
Speaking of those deep undercurrents in the culture, there was a time in your tenure where an independent investigation of the culture of Rio Tinto was undertaken with a report. Can you just tell us what the impetus for this investigation was? What did the report find, and what did you do with it?
So, in one of our first executive team meetings, when we had that meeting, there was a front page on an Australian newspaper that a woman had been raped in a mine in Australia. It was not a Rio Tinto mine, but nonetheless. We were sitting there and we said, could this happen in our mine? And the question was raised and there was a lot of silence in the room, and we kind of, from that silence, concluded we had to get to know more. And then we hired Liz Broderick, who was the former sex commissioner in Australia, as a consultant. And we said, can you just give us a report, you know? What do you need, 2-3 weeks? And she said, no, it doesn't work like that. I need 6 to 9 months. Okay. And what she was amazingly good at, she traveled around to the mines and she was able to create some safe rooms where people felt comfortable about speaking up. And what we learned was things that we didn't know, which is quite uncomfortable. And it was very clear that there was issues around bullying, about racism, and about sexism. And of course, you always rather wants to know than not know. The problem was just, we have to address this. And how do you address that in a global organization with 60,000 staff in a kind of a discreet way? Well, the answer is you can't. So we were sitting with this report, 60 pages, and it was not nice reading. So what are we going to do about that? And we just, in the end, concluded the only thing we could do was to just put it on the web and take the pain of going through the media storm for a couple of days. But then it was out there, and that meant that everybody could talk about it. And I must admit, I was quite nervous, and it was quite painful to meet the media and talk about this. But the beauty afterwards was, I mean, I still remember there was like almost just a week after I went bicycling with 10 colleagues in Brisbane, and they said, wow, we're talking about this report in the company, but also with our spouses, with our kids, etc. And that was what we needed. We just needed to start talking about it. That's the first stage to actually address that. But it's quite painful to go through.
What was the vote on publishing the report? You mentioned before you were outvoted on the history book and prevailed, but was this a unanimous?
No, I don't. Look, everybody realized this is a Jakob decision because I had to front it. So there was nothing. But I think people said we are struggling to see anything else. Because then we talked about how we can take an executive summary, a 10 pages executive summary. Yes, we can do that. The first thing a journalist will do is saying, why are you only giving me an executive summary? Why can't I see the report? So no matter, we tried all sorts of strategy. There is no strategy other than just putting it out.
Transparency.
Yeah.
I believe we have joining us from Switzerland the president of IMD, David Bach.
Ah, lovely.
And here he is. David, hello.
There. Hey, Jakob. Hey, John.
Good to see you.
Hello, and David
Good to see you too, man. When I saw that you were visiting my old stomping ground, I thought, I couldn't miss the opportunity to listen in. And John was kind enough to say, well, if you're listening in, then turn on your video for a moment. And
amazing.
of course, the context here is that we've been, working with you all. And while Yale did the terrific case study on the aftermath of Juukan, we did the case study on everyday respect. And so I thought I'd contribute a couple of thoughts. But John, it's your session. How can I help?
No, exactly right. So just for some context here for our colleagues joining here. So David is former deputy dean of School of Management here at Yale, now president of IMD, and also documented specifically the circumstances of this report and your decision to make it public. So I just invite you, David, based on your knowledge of that aspect of the story here, what are your thoughts that you would offer us?
Yeah, it's been fascinating listening to both of you. And I just wanted to underscore how courageous that decision was. And for me, Jakob, it really encapsulates the courage of your leadership and the circumstances under which you assumed the leadership of Rio, and that you had that courage to really try to reset the relationship with stakeholders in the matter that you did, rebuilding trust, emphasizing transparency. And perhaps, John, one thing that would be, I think, helpful for some of the participants in the session to understand was, and Jakob, I think you alluded to it just now in your comment about the executive summary, you really can't think about leading inside the organization and outside the organization anymore. Right? The boundaries have become very porous. Everybody who works for your organization has a family outside of that organization. They have neighbors, they have a community, information flows. And, we use the everyday respect case, and it's based on video interviews with Liz Broderick and 3 of your executive committee members who speak in very moving ways about how they processed all of this, right? James, Isabel, and my God, why am I blanking right now? Australia CEO, my God. Anyway, I'll come back to me. And Kelly, of course, Kelly is the third one. Kelly. So they speak very movingly about this, but I think what is so powerful about it is that by being transparent, not hiding what you had found, you take the first step in building trust, and that same effort that you were doing internally really helped rebuild trust externally. And I remember, Kelly Parker, the CEO of Australia, who you appointed, speaking to us about how people in the community with Indigenous people sort of started trusting Rio again, in part because Rio had been transparent about what hadn't been working inside the company. And so it's interesting when we think about stakeholder management, we often think external, but what you do internally is very much seen by people outside the organizations. For me, it's been fascinating to understand how internal and external change and stakeholder relations come together. And again, we use the case here at IMD. For us, it's an incredibly powerful case study about doing something courageous in order to strengthen culture, being transparent in order to build trust. And I'm sure we'll be using the case for many, many years to come. So thank you for letting us work with you on that. And again, on behalf of my sort of former home at Yale. I'm so glad that you're there. You're sitting right there, and you're sharing all of this with the terrific Yale students and everybody across the global network.
So I hope you can see my surprise, because I didn't know that David was coming here, and I get quite emotional about it, because IMD, I should say I serve on the board, whatever that means, of IMD, and I have taken...
Well, it means that you're one of my bosses, Jakob.
Well, and I have taken my team every year for a week to Lausanne for IMD, because in general, I try to avoid using too much management consultants. Because I much rather take my team to a business school, because the professors are not trying to solve the problem for me, but they are trying to help facilitate that the leadership team, that the leaders are finding the ways to think through and solve the problems we need to solve. And I just firmly believe in that concept. It works. It could have been Yale. It happened to be IMD, so it's great to see you, David.
Okay, so since you did that with IMD, whenever you become CEO for the next company, it will be Yale. Yes?
Certainly, if I move to the US.
Listen, thank you, David. And there are so many questions here about mining. And I do want to open it up. But before I turn to one of our colleagues here, Vanshika? You had a question? As you get the microphone, I want to just ask you one more question about the connection or relationship, or perhaps there isn't one in your view, between Juukan Gorge, destruction of the caves, and this report on the culture of the company being about sexism, racism, and bullying. Related, unrelated?
No, it's super related, because just think about it. There's been written a several hundred pages report following the inquiry of Juukan Gorge, and people explains all sorts of things. But in my view, that's not how to look at it. In my view, it can be said very simple. Had we just had the right relationship with the indigenous people, the people of PKKP, this would never have happened. Because we would have understood that even though we had got approval from the Australian government, that this should not have happened. But we did not have the right relationships. And there was also not the right relationships inside the company, amongst leaders to employees in between. We had become inward-looking, become more transactional, and it was because certain things had gone wrong over the last 15 years in Rio. We become very short-termish, and that was the thing that needed to fix. So the root causes are the same.
I could go on about the root cause, but let's turn to Vanshika's question about the mining industry and perhaps about AI.
Hello, I'm Vanshika. I'm from the MBA cohort at the Yale School of Management. My question was, with de-dollarization, the global commodity supercycle, and rising demand for copper, lithium, and rare earths driven by EVs, green energy, and AI, how is Rio Tinto adopting its strategy to stay competitive and sustainable in this shifting global order?
Yeah, no, thank you. And of course, what we have talked about here was the start of my tenure, because you first of all have to have a kind of a social license that you are accepted. But the stronger that grew, the more we could actually move towards what you normally work at a business school, in terms of how do I drive the company with profitable growth. The company had not grown for 10 years. And it became more and more clear that what we are producing was actually very much in demand. And as we are the second largest mining company on the planet, we have a lot of competences that smaller mining company doesn't have. It makes no sense. We got to invest in this. We are already the world's largest producer of iron ore. Iron ore is critical because steel is critical for all developing countries. You want to get up the GDP per capita, you need steel to build your country. Now, you need to deal with the CO2 challenge, not an easy one, mainly not in the part we are in, but in the steel making part. But the beauty for Rio was that the whole energy transition, and it's not just about CO2, it's also towards more electrification. AI will require a lot of more electricity, etc. And EVs, of course, are electrical. So, just electricity demand is going up. If you look at the International Energy Agency, they talk about that the demand growth at the end of this decade will be 6 times higher for electricity than for energy in general. So what does that mean? We are the Western world's largest producer of aluminium. Good, you need more aluminium. Secondly, we are one of the world's largest producers of copper. Even better, aluminium and copper are the 2 materials that transport electricity. Aluminium has got the best ability per kilo, and so that's why when you have things hanging in the air, you use aluminium, and if it's in the ground, you use copper because it's got the best conductivity. Amazing materials. And then we made a big bet we started it at the beginning of my tenure, but we made a really big bet last year, and we are now the largest resource holders of lithium. Because if you think about it, the world needs batteries, not just the EVs. You need stationary batteries to balance solar cells. The problem with a lot of renewable energy is it's not very valuable because it's kind of on and off, but the prices on stationary batteries are going down a lot. Secondly, you see much more in the air. Drones needs batteries, robots needs batteries, etc. So societies are going to be much more electrified, and it means demand for our products. And that's what we're doing. We're growing the company. As I just left it, we have a very firm 3 to 4% growth per year over the next decade. And then you say, that's not a lot. No, it's not. But it's because it's so capital intensive. It does require $10 to $12 billion of investments every year. You cannot grow very capital-intensive companies with too high percentages. But I tell you, make your calculations, 3 or 4% growth in 10 years' time, and then compare to many of our competitors who are basically contracting 1, 2, 3% a year. Makes a huge difference. You have to think long-term. Thanks for the question.
Lin Hang, Lin Hang is in the room here. Yes, you have a kind of a different angle on the question of mining in the future.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Lin Han, second year MBA. Yes, my question is on, obviously, Rio Tinto is more of a land mining and processing company. There are alternative ways of getting rare earth and other critical minerals that have different implications. Have you done any research on, for example, deep sea mining, which is one of the biggest topics, and that the current administration signed an executive order to advance that? And how do you see that moving forward?
Absolutely. And first of all, it's important for you to understand that you don't really create a mine for rare earths. Rare earths is typically byproducts. You've got some big mines in the world. You've got iron ore mines, you've got copper mines, you've got bauxite mines for aluminium, you've got mineral sands, and you've got 6, 7 types of big mines. And the rare earths will be byproducts. And very often you measure it in a few tons, whereas the other might be in millions of tons. So Rio Tinto produces 1 million tons of iron ore every day. Whereas we, for example, produce a very special material, scandium, 10 tons a year. So it's completely different. Now, the beauty about the big materials like copper and iron ore is that it's a very liquid market, a commodity market, and you have a market price for it. The rare earths you don't really have. And it's very difficult because we got rare earths in what we are mining, but you need to build manufacturing for it, and that's where the East have been better than the West. Starting with Japan, Korea, but really China have done amazingly well on building the processing, often from ore that doesn't stem from China, but has been imported from, say, Africa, etc. We have lost a lot of manufacturing capabilities in the West and here in the US. For example, the US used to have 20 copper smelters. There's only 2 left now. We got one of them in Salt Lake City. And if you don't have processing, you will not have rare earths. That is the problem. And it raises the question about the business model, because it's very difficult for a mining company to just start saying, now we're going to build this plant and produce this, when we don't really know who's going to buy the products. And I tell you a story that might help you. After the Second World War, the British Prime Minister, what was his name?
Churchill?
Yeah, Churchill. He said to Rio Tinto, go find uranium and save mankind. Oh, that's quite a statement. But basically the deal was, you go and find uranium and we will buy the uranium. And when you have that cover, that we had a long-term supply contract with the British government, we could go out and explore for uranium. And within 10 years, Rio Tinto was the world's largest producer of uranium. So it is about reimagining the business model, if that's what you want to achieve. There are definitely solutions. The world is not lacking rare earths. It's a matter of processing it. Thank you.
We have several questions that are questions about your own reflections and also kind of advice for the students. But in our final minutes here, we'll turn to several of these. But before we do that, I want to come back to what you said earlier. You said long term, and then you said that the root cause, both of what happened with the caves and what happened to your culture, was linked to short-termism. It may not be obvious to some. What is the relationship between short-term thinking and then how that could result in Juukan Gorge and in a let's call it a toxic culture?
So I'm a great believer in continuous improvement. You have to improve your productivity all the time. But unfortunately, very often when you have to save cost, people are doing things in the wrong way. And we got it wrong. We bought the Canadian aluminium company Alcan just before the financial crisis, far too expensive. And we kind of almost went broke and had to really save a lot of money. And people started cutting costs, so a lot of people were fired. It was not an elegant process, and we were not maintaining our plants well enough. That is toxic, and that is actually really a stupid strategy, because when you have a very profitable business, you better take care of your assets and your people. So it was not continuous improvement. And that kind of led to an eroding culture. When people go and see you're not maintaining the plants, and when people don't feel that management are taking well care of the people, then everything starts eroding. It's a bit like, then people start throwing some rubbish on the ground, and when you see rubbish on the ground, others starts doing the same thing. It kind of degrades a bit. And that's what I mean, that the same root causes.
Well, here's a question from Boyd Rowe from UNSW Business School in Australia. What's one strategic decision or approach you wish you'd handled differently?
Look, there's so many things that I've done wrong. But I must admit, I'm also sitting here after 5 years and looking back and saying, I don't have any regrets because I couldn't have done it. I think the most important thing for a CEO is you are a little bit the energy of the company. If you start circle around and you don't take decisions, you bring the company to a standstill. So you have to kind of just use your best instincts and move forward, take decisions, and accept that some of them goes right or go wrong. I mean, and if I really should talk about what went wrong, but I don't know. I mean, I was lucky that certain things went right. We had a lithium mine in Serbia, and it has turned out to be absolutely not successful. Basically, we found it in 2005, and when I took over, I said, let's get going on this. And I took it to the board, and we approved developing the mine. I went and saw the president. He loved the project, and as soon as he went out, the opposition started attacking the project in order to attack the president. And the situation in Serbia has just made it very difficult for us to progress. And it wasn't helped that Djokovic when he turned up in Australia for the Australia Open, was sent back because he didn't believe in what do you call it? He was an anti-vaxxer. And that created a very big momentum in Serbia, saying the Western world is not treating Serbia well. And then they took my licenses, and now we got the licenses back, but we still haven't built it, and we have spent 600 million. So absolutely, things goes wrong. But the point is, you need to work on a number of options. You don't know what goes right and what goes wrong. At the end of the day, what you'll be measured on is that more things goes right than goes wrong.
Ayush, are you in the room? You had a question sort of about why do you want to be a CEO? Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, my name's Ayush. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences here at Yale. So my question was on, you mentioned your 10 interviews for the role of CEO, and I think a lot of people would consider the role of CEO of Rio Tinto after such a crisis as quite an unenviable role. Were there any moments during the interview process where you had your doubts, when you felt maybe I don't want to take on this job?
This is a very important question and a quite personal question. And I think for yourself, as you excel in your career, you have to think about whether you want or you don't want, but you perhaps even more have to ask yourself why. I have been quite ambitious in my career, and I probably would have liked to have been a CEO earlier. I'm absolutely convinced that it was good for me and for whoever worked with me that I first became CEO when I was 52, because I wasn't mature for it. I simply hadn't matured my leadership before. And I think actually I also came to a stage where I didn't want to be CEO because Jakob, wanted to have the title of CEO. I was brought into a crisis. I didn't know about it. A headhunter recruited me to CFO of a company that I didn't know, in an industry I didn't know. I came to like the company, and I just felt that there was a way forward and I could play a vital role in that. And that's kind of was more about me voting for the company than me from being CEO. And from where I was appointed, I never regretted it, because it was kind of like, this is a given. You got to solve this, Jakob. and it's been very intense. I tell you, I mean, when I started, I realized the first thing I had to do was to go to where the problem was. So I flew to Perth. I took my 2 weeks of hotel quarantine, and I went up and saw the indigenous people. That was really hard and painful. And then I stayed in Australia, because that was where we had the problem, for 4.5 months before I flew back. And quite frankly, I wanted to go back and see my wife and my children, etc. But it was kind of like, I just had to solve this. And it's kind of, I think the key thing, this is going to be very important for you in your career, is about getting to know yourself. How can you take yourself out of the equation? The key thing for a CEO, for a leadership team, for a leader, is how do you take yourself out so that it all becomes about the company, not about yourself? And look, we are all humans, so of course sometimes it is about yourself, but the more you can do that, the better.
Jakob, we have just a few minutes left. So our colleagues here and around the world are going to be leaders in a world that is simultaneously unchanged and unrecognizable. So based on everything you've learned, what advice would you give our colleagues?
Look, I have 2 advices for you, but before I do that, I'll say things. It's very important to stay curious, and curious means keep on learning and being prepared to de-learn. So I was reading my master's in economics in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was all about a world that was globalizing. Then I've been working for 25 years, and it was all about globalization. That globalization has led to a huge dislocation of where is things produced and where is it being consumed, etc., and it's unstable. It's going to change now. It doesn't matter. I can say I don't like it, I like globalization. It doesn't matter. the world is changing. You have to just look at the world we're living in. Right now, it's frictious. With change, we human beings are not against change. But with change goes pain. And we don't like the pain. And that's what we are facing right now. So I think we just have to look at the world and be not too judgmental on it. It has to go through change. And for that, I have two advices for you. First of all, I have already said it. You learn a lot of disciplines in management, but think about, know yourself. It's gonna help you a lot. And the second thing is, take care of yourself. You know, I showed it to our leadership group. You probably seen it 100 times when you're in a plane. You sit there and there's a kid your kid is sitting next to you, and what is it you should do? You should, if the masks are falling down, you should not put the mask on your kid first. You should put the mask on yourself first, so you are sure of that you can help your kid putting the mask on. How can you take care of others as a leader if you don't take care of yourself? You don't have to run a marathon if you rather want to go to yoga, but you have to make sure you get your sleep patterns and you take care of yourself physically, because otherwise you're not going to be an amazing leader.
Well, you're an amazing leader, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your candor with all of us today. Please join me in thanking Jakob Stausholm.
Thank you.